This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 432, Portals and Community Websites. This episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. On today's show, we are talking about portals, community websites, and Drupal with guest Ron Northcutt, who will also cover private message as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Ron Northcutt. Ron is a professional problem solver with a varied career ranging from developer, solutions architect, technical marketing director, and now head of developer relations. He has been a Drupal user and contributor since 4.6 and continues to find it to be one of the best open source development frameworks available. You can find his current writings and contributions on the AppSmith community portal at community.appsmith.com, which is built on Drupal. Ron, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us for the last 4 episodes.
Thanks. It's been fun.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, John Bacuzzi, solutions architect at EPAM.
Happy New Year, Talking Drupal listeners.
And also joining us, Martin Anderson-Klutz, senior solutions engineer at Acquia.
Happy New Year, everyone.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin. What do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever wanted to include a full-fledged Ajaxified system for private messages between users on your Drupal site? There's a module for that. It's called Private Message, and it was originally created in April of 2017 by JPAN, a fellow Canadian, but the most recent release is by Lucas Heading, who hails from Nicaragua and is a prolific contrib maintainer in his own right. Now, it has, in terms of versions available, 8.x-2.0, beta 18, and 3.0 versions available, the latter of which works with Drupal 9 and 10. It is actively maintained. In fact, that latest release was in October of 2023. It has 130 open issues, but only 4 of those are bugs against the 3.0.x branch. It does have test coverage, and it does have documentation, although the handbook pages seem to date back to 2017, so hopefully the installation setup haven't changed too much since then. It is officially in use by almost 2,000 sites, and really the private message module works by giving your users permissions-based access to send private messages to each other once the module is installed. The messages and threads entities are fieldable, and in general, the module is made to be highly configurable, so you can tailor it to meet your site's specific needs. That includes the frequency for asynchronous operations like loading new messages, which can be done without a full page refresh. There's also a companion module to use for Node.js for the asynchronous operations to reduce load on both the server and the browser. Now, that configuration or the asynchronous setup also allows for browser push notifications. Or you can use the integration with the message module to send notifications via email, SMS, and more, including aggregating the notifications into digests. Companies have often have a dedicated messaging solution like Slack or Teams that they use for internal users, but something like this can be a good solution for an extranet or a vendor portal where the users may represent a variety of organizations. It's also worth mentioning that both private message and the message modules are included in the open social distribution, so that could be a way to try out a pre-configured setup. So let's talk about private message.
Man, so many ideas with this one. I'm like, oh, like could this be like a chat feature on your website where you're like, oh, support chat, go ahead, start a message, or just a way for users in a community, very topical, for to communicate with one another. I've never used this module, but it sounds very, very cool. One question I do have, not sure if anybody has used it or is aware of this. If it's creating entities for each private message, are those entities deleted after they've been concluded, or like is there some sort of cleanup, or is it a potential for you to have like hundreds of kind of like private message nodes floating around your Drupal website?
I mean, I suppose technically they would be message entities and not nodes, but I know what you mean, and I suspect that you would probably want to have some kind of a system. I don't know if one is provided, but I can definitely see, um, that potentially being an issue if it is a feature that gets heavily used.
Right. I mean, either way, I think it's pretty cool. I think it gets you a large part of the way there. I think what's interesting is like if any of our listeners are inclined, I'd love to see like a comparison between this and like some popular like support chat tools to see how it stacks up or what the pros and cons to going one way versus the other might be.
Yeah,
It would,
I imagine there's a bunch of performance things to consider too with this kind of thing because you know people you can have a highly trafficked site or even a high content site, but people aren't creating people generally aren't creating pages and nodes at the rate that you would be for something like this, right? Where you're like when people are chatting, people sometimes will send 5 or 10 messages in like 5 seconds, right? Like that can really increase load. Although having kind of an infrastructure and module to kind of work around those types of issues with, I think is huge value.
Those
I would
those
not want to
stream
build
of
this myself.
those stream of conscious those stream of conscious chatters that are like every thought is a different sentence, a different chat message. That's what I think Nick's talking about there.
yeah, I think in the context of support, I could also see there being value. If you were using like a Zendesk or something like that, using their chat probably has features where it's easier to either like ingest that whole conversation into a ticket as you create it. So, like for some of those UK use cases, using an integration that ties directly
Yeah.
into that use case, maybe of higher value. But to me, as you say, the value of something in Drupal is that it's a very flexible. You can sort of tie
Yeah.
that into exactly whatever it is your site is trying to use. And if you don't have that other system, then this can be a nice way to sort of satisfy that.
I mean, there's also a potential cost savings there too, right? Like you have a system like Zendesk or something like that you're paying for. Like if you can, there's various sides to that argument. I know, like you're paying for it, it's getting feature enhancements, but rolling your own sometimes is necessary and beneficial. So definitely can see both
This
sides.
is actually on our backlog for our community portal, and one of the things I want to roll out this year. And in our use case, we have a Discord community for the communities to chat. But one of the big things that we also have is we have a directory of users that have opted in to be listed and their profile listed.
Oh, okay.
And people can mark themselves as being like open for work. They're freelancers, consultants, etc. So one of the challenges is you find somebody that looks like they can do something you want or they can help you with something. How do you find them? How do you reach out to them? Like, are they on Discord? Are they on right now? How do I find them? So that's one of the gaps this is going to help us fill, is allow people to connect, whether they're looking for help or they want to work on something together or what have you. So yeah, this is a good timing for us. We're going to be doing this hopefully in the next quarter or two.
Oh, very cool. Well, thanks, Martin. And if listeners have suggestions, what's the best way for them to do that?
They can find me on all the Drupal platforms as @manclue, but happy to also receive nominations for Module of the Week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack.
Now, before we move on to our primary topic, this episode of Talking Drupal is sponsored by Hero Devs. Let's talk about life after Drupal 7 end of life. Since August 2023, there's been a lot of discussion around Drupal 7's official end of life in January of 2025, which is now only 1 year away. It's no secret that many companies, organizations, and individuals are still on Drupal 7 and have yet to migrate. I think we can all agree that migration, while beneficial, is not always feasible, and this is where Hero Devs comes in. Hero Devs has partnered with a core team maintainers of Drupal 7 to build and maintain their Drupal 7 never-ending support product, ensuring the same quality of support you have come to expect over the years. Drupal 7's never-ending support, or NES, allows for an effortless transition, allowing your site to remain secure, compliant, and compatible after Drupal 7 goes end of life. This allows you to migrate in your own time. Hero Devs promises to keep Drupal 7 alive and well, even offering support for the current top 100 Drupal 7 modules. If you'd like to know more about Drupal 7 never-ending support, visit herodevs.com. That's HERODEVS.com. Okay, now onto our primary topic. Why are you so passionate about web portals and community sites?
I think for a couple of reasons. I mean, one of the big ones is that, when I got started with Drupal, there wasn't Drupal Slack, and there really weren't any, accessible Drupal events. So the only way to connect with other people was through Drupal.org. And back then, it was through the forum, but also issue queues.
Or IRC.
Or IRC. This is true. Man, you're making me feel really old now. I was just reading an article about how Gopher's trying to make a comeback. So anyway, that was kind of the big thing. And then in the last few years, I've had the opportunity to build some things. So I did the initial build of the developer portal for Acquia, which was really at that time in need. It was kind of on life support, wasn't doing much, wasn't taking advantage of Drupal. So I had the opportunity to kind of come in and help get that going, which was really rewarding. And then saw the same need at AppSmith, where we have this Discord channel, but how do you share actual content? How do you have threaded comments and stuff on that content? How do you allow yourself to post something in a sort of social media way, kind of like a LinkedIn for developers? Like there's this need, and while there are a lot of off-the-shelf solutions, they all just solve a bit of the problem. So coming back around again, being a longtime Drupalist, I was like, I didn't see anything that could give us what we truly needed, and I knew that Drupal would. So we decided to build it.
There's definitely a high degree of customization there that Drupal provides, and I think we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But before we get to that, it was interesting to me that when you brought this topic up, Ron, because I kind of went back to my own past, and one of my early projects in Drupal 7, I think it was, maybe it was 6, but was a intranet for a healthcare system, right? And like that to me is kind of synonymous with a portal, right? So like portals are typically
Right.
topic specific things that people use to do their jobs or to connect with other folks, right? So I was thinking about that, and I was just curious. You mentioned a portal for Acquia. You're obviously currently building kind of a community site at your current job. Are there any other types of portals or community sites that you've worked on, or that we could kind of use to frame our conversation today?
I mean, going all the way back to Drupal 5, before I was doing development full time, I actually built out, I was doing real estate, and I built out what was initially just going to be like a marketing site for me. And I was taking specific properties that I was exporting every day and importing in so people could search for investors. And then from that, adding in comments and things like that, and actually started inadvertently creating like an investor portal, which was kind of the first place I started playing with it. But, I would say probably one of the biggest is that one of the advantages in my background as a solutions architect, like Martin, right, is having the opportunity to talk to so many different organizations. And so I've seen and been a part of a lot of conversations for people building intranet portals or customer portals, or dozens and dozens that I haven't actually built myself, but I've either helped advise on, or helped get them excited about what they could do, or come in after the fact and helped figure out how they could make things better. So that's kind of where some of that comes from.
2 follow-up questions for me. One, the real estate, portal site that you were working on, were you like pulling in MLS into that, or was it like, something? Yeah, you were doing a little bit of that. So that's super interesting. I think, we'll talk a little bit later, maybe about, pulling in different data sources and kind of working with that. And then I also kind of wanted to open the question up to Nick and Martin to offer up any other types of portals or community sites that they've worked on, just for kind of reference. So, as we have our conversation today, we can kind of pick on those different use cases if they exist.
I can maybe chime in. A couple of years ago, there was a pretty sizable project that I was working on that was interesting because there was sort of a central organization that actually had employees, but then they had a whole set of volunteers that they wanted to go into their intranet, and so there was sort of that tier of users that were going in and doing a bunch of sort of organizational things, and then there were also sort of like beneficiaries of the organization, and so there were all of these different groups, some of which had very, very disparate sort of like needs in terms of like what capabilities they needed to do, what kind of data they need to access, and those kinds of things. So had lots of interesting discussions with them around how can you tailor the experience to those different kinds of users so that as you go in, you're seeing information and prompts and calls to action that are really relevant to who you are within the system.
Interesting. What about you, Nick?
Yeah, I think for me, there's only been a couple that were kind of exposed. One of them was more community focused than the other. The first is one of my first clients, which was originally a Drupal 5 site, was a small town newspaper, and actually several small town newspapers, and they were trying to experiment with getting some of their I don't know if constituents is the right word, readership. They're a free newspaper, so they don't have subscribers because they ship to every person in the town. They were trying to experiment with getting them on the website and commenting on articles, but they also wanted them to kind of have a sort of classified section, and they were trying to build a sort of small town community. This was right around when Facebook was really starting to take off, so 2008, 2009. So it didn't quite exist as kind of the de facto place online. That was my first time in installing the forum module and the forum advanced forum module. It was also my first experience with spam from bots on a website. And it kind of really started one of the things I really liked about Drupal in the early days was you really could just kind of experiment. That's something that, Ron, you've mentioned a few times, where you have a problem, you find a module, you install it, you find the edge of that problem, and you have to install a new module. That was really the first time I worked on kind of a community, with the invention of Facebook and kind of taking over. That particular site now uses Facebook for all that type of interaction. The only other place that I really did a community that was kind of public, because a lot of the other communities type stuff is more back end, right? Intranet, it's all just the organization. Was a fencing club I was part of. They wanted kind of a way for students to kind of share information about tournaments that they went on, sign up for classes, that kind of thing. But that was a lot more rudimentary. It's more just core comments and things like that and posts. But those are the two that I've worked on primarily. It's been a while.
So, Ron, you mentioned the breadth of those different conversations that you've been a part of. Thinking back across all of those, are there some common features that you have heard brought up across those different conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the challenge is that everyone's unique, right? And that's one of the reasons why Drupal is so powerful in this space. But there are some very common things, and I think for a lot of people in kind of the Drupal space, a lot of the common things are things that we completely take for granted. So things like account creation, password reset, security, structured content of different types, comments, permissions around who can do what, different things you can do with like media. Like those are all really, really big problems that you have to solve in order to start putting something together. But because honestly, just out of the box, Drupal provides for so much of that stuff that you can actually, that your foundation is solid. So then you can get into the actual really interesting, really useful conversations like, What are you trying to accomplish? Who are you talking to? What's the best way to do that? So you can, that's why every single Drupal site is different, right? Even if you're using the exact same modules, even if 20 sites are using the private messaging module, there's going to be different use cases. This one's using it for, support. This one's using it because they don't have or don't want to set up Slack for external customers. This one's using it like we're talking about so that we can connect, someone who needs help with a developer who wants to provide it. I think that's one of the powerful things. And because Drupal handles all of that stuff for you, it puts you in the space of being really creative.
I think there's another, just to add on to what you're saying, Ron, I think there's another thing that I'm really starting to appreciate with Drupal as I've worked on projects with other technologies in the past year or two, is that it's not just the flexibility. Part of it is Drupal has, I mean, it is the API, but Drupal has kind of especially since Drupal 8, it has a really well-defined way to interact with modules. I mean, Drupal's always had that, but with the hook system, a lot of times building hooks, I feel like took more effort than kind of building a service or a class in Drupal 8, 9, 10 now. So on older modules, it had to be a big module to really have a robust hook system that you could hook into. I mean, Core always had that, but with Drupal 9 and 10, even fairly simple modules will have some sort of class or method that you can override or service that you can inject. And that means not just the custom is it's flexible. It means that you can customize it how you need to and generally be sure that it's not going to break. Whereas a lot of other platforms, you can customize it, but you're hacking contrib, right?
And that was one of the big challenges I faced, especially here at AppSmith, because there wasn't really no one knew Drupal as well as I did. They'd heard of it, but we had been using Discourse before I came along, which is a very robust forum system. It's actually incredibly common in DevRel to use, lots of modules, lots of customization options. And I kept coming in and saying, well, it's just it's not flexible enough. And they're like, well, what do you need it for? Like, well, I want to do this and do this. Well, there's other services for that. I'm like, yeah, you're right. But I'm telling you the things that I don't know that I need yet, that we figure out later that we need. I know that I can do that with Drupal. If I go with something else, I'm going to have to start cobbling together different pieces, which may or may not work. And it's going to get overly complex. Once you start trying to do really cool things, it gets hard and you hit that limit really fast. And I did reach out to a lot of folks in the DevRel community, doing research, asking for feedback from different people on some of the different platforms. And that was the number one response I kept getting back. It's like, Discourse is good, but as soon as you need to customize, it gets painful. This is pretty good, but as soon as you need a feature outside of their feature set, you just can't get it, period. So that helped me make my case for doing this, which was pretty cool.
It's interesting because the question is around common features, right? And obviously there are a set of common features that every platform, every portal, every community site needs. Login probably being one of the biggest ones, right? Being able to post comments, being able to post content, that sort of thing. But it's interesting to hear your one of the other commonalities there is not so much the common features, but the features we don't know we need yet, and then how those get integrated back into the system, right? And that's true, I think, of any platform or any site of these types out there, right? Is you don't know what you're going to need in the future, and then what's the structure to add that if you need to, with a lot of these off the shelf solutions or out of the box or software, paid solutions, right? You often are kind of handcuffed in some areas to say oh, well, we really need to do this unique thing to us. And it's well, we can't do that yet, but.
Right. Yeah. Well, and Nick, to your point, I think it's worth noting that I've got I lead up a team. So I've got a couple of DevRel people, and one of them actually comes from the Drupal community. Kevin Blanco, also AKA Mr. White. He's awesome from Costa Rica. If you guys ever get a chance, you meet up with him. He's great. And Kevin has helped a bit, but as he has taken more and more responsibility elsewhere, especially with our video channel and our events, he just hasn't had the time. So we launched our portal, the very first version, like I think it was end of Q1 in 2023. And except for a little bit of Kevin's help with some of the hosting and some of we moved it to a different host and things like that, it's pretty much just been me. And I don't have a ton of time. So if I can get 6 or 8 hours a week to work on it and extend and add features, I'm doing good. And the reason I say that is because I would not be able to get as much done as I can if I didn't have the system to leverage.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, Nick, it's not just about grabbing a module, but I've had to do stuff with user points. I've had to do stuff with flag module. I've had to do stuff where I had to create my own service, or I had to create my own plugins, or I had to do whatever. And given 6 hours in a week to try and implement 1 or 2 new features or fix something or override something that helps us, if I didn't have the shoulders of those giants to stand on and that awesome system that was built to be extended, I would just be crawling. Versus now, even without the time, I'm flying. And that just gives a lot of confidence, and it builds a lot of more interest, both within the company as well as within the community, because they're seeing movement, they're seeing new features, they're seeing new stuff come out, which would be insane to think of one person doing with a 1 day a week at max. It's ridiculous.
I mean, specifically, like I'm seeing that in the WordPress community, right? Because a lot of the plugins are, I think part of the reason a lot of the plugins are paid, so they don't have like the built-in, like here's the API to integrate it. If you want to mash all these things together, like you really have to dig in and deeply understand how they wrote their code in order to change things. Like even down, it amazes me time and time again the things that Drupal has just solved forever that I've never had to worry about. Like in Drupal, if you call a service, like you never have to worry about a module being loaded at the time. Like the service will be there unless you're doing like really, really low level bootstrap things. The module will be there. And those are just things that, in Drupal, the core team has put so much effort into kind of those low level things and continue to make sure that those are covered, that, as a developer, whether you're developing a contrib module or a custom module, like you just don't have to worry about that. If you have a dependency, you put it in your info YAML, and Drupal handles making sure that it's available for you, right? I mean, you have to make sure it's in the code base, right? Whether by build or something, but as long as it's there, Drupal makes sure that it's installed. Like Drupal takes care of that stuff out of the box, and that's an incredibly, I'm beginning to appreciate that more and more. I'd like to kind of pivot slightly. It's funny. I think like everybody on this call, I think Drupal is a great solution for almost everything. After having built that forum site, forums, even though forum is a core module, is one of those things that I do consider going outside of Drupal for. I actually have built a couple other forums in Drupal. It's not always the case that I go outside of Drupal for, but it is one of the few use cases where I consider it. I'm curious about how you go about deciding that Drupal is a good solution for these types of sites, and why. I know you kind of went through the discourse piece of it, but where's that line when you should go outside of Drupal for something versus use Drupal for everything internally?
So the original plan was not to use Drupal at all, actually. The original plan was we wanted to use Markdown and GitHub as our content source, and then use Next.js and statically generate. And I actually found a really cool, there's actually like 2 or 3 different versions, but a really cool open source project that allows you to do comments as GitHub issues. So if I'm on the website, I log in, using Ajax to GitHub, and then I add my comments. Those are actually reading comments on an issue that was created to match that piece of content. So we had a kind of a cool like setup, and I was like, yeah, this is great. If people want to contribute, they can do a pull request for an article, yada, yada. And as we kept expanding the scope of what we needed, it became very clear that was that was never going to do it. Like if we were able to keep it really simple, it would have been really cool. And I think like for a personal blog or something, that'd be amazing. So the first thing that we started looking at was we did look at some other things, and I was aware of my own bias. And so I was trying to be very careful not to just impose Drupal because that's what I want. And one thing I've said many, many times to people is that you can build anything with Drupal. That doesn't mean you should, right? So looked at some other open source projects, looked at some actual SaaS offerings that were out there. But again, kept coming back to recognizing that we were going to hit these limitations on the things we needed to do and wanted to do, and needed that low level control that I didn't want to do those other pieces for. So I think it also depends. So on the one piece, I think it depends on what are your needs, both today and projected forward. I think that's a key. Number two, I think the key, it comes down to understanding what resources do you have. Like I don't have a development team. I don't have a development budget. I was lucky to scrape together the budget for hosting, right? So, but because I have the experience and the skill, I knew that I could carry that. So that was fine. But if somebody didn't have Drupal experience, or they didn't have a developer, Discourse might be better and just live with limitations, or even WordPress, or, I don't know, PHP BB or whatever you want to use, right? Like it, or Common Room, or there's tons and tons of things out there to use. So I think it depends on your needs, it depends on your resources, and then it depends on like how ambitious do you want to be. Regardless, I think most of the time you have to accept that there's going to be some limitation. So the question is, what do those limits look like a year, 2 years, 5 years down the road? Can you live with those? Or are you going to plan to, we're going to start this thing, and as it picks up steam and as it becomes bigger, we know we're going to have to migrate or rebuild or do something. So it could very well be that you start with something like Discourse or some SaaS offering today, and know that in the next 3 years, you're going to build something custom.
Yeah. I think one of the hidden costs of those types of systems, I think there's a few. We kind of at a high level touched on them, but one is, there's usually not, there's probably less initial setup for something like Discourse, right?
Exactly.
That's part of what you're paying for. But if you start integrating with other systems, there's a time budget because those integrations break, right? Or the other system that you're using closes down, and now you have to figure out how to migrate that data, or you lose all that data and you have to find a new solution. The other thing that happens is, like you said, as you start getting more complex, you get more vendor lock-in, and then once you get enough vendor lock-in, I'm not saying Discourse does this, but in general, a lot of these SaaS services are like, oh, you're now enterprise, so add 4 more zeros to the end of your bill, and you're free to migrate if you want to, but you have 2 weeks before that new bill starts. And with Drupal, many times, other than, there's some systemic things, like we talked about private message and we talked about forums, like as they grow, like you have to make sure that the infrastructure can handle it, right? Sure. But in general, with Drupal, once a feature's built, it's built, right? Aside from, major version upgrades and things like that. Like once it's built, it's built. You're not having to continually tweak that, other than adding new features, maybe some technical debt cleanup, that kind of thing. So if you go into a position where you're at right now, Ron, where you kind of have to freeze budget for a little while or freeze development time, it's less of a risk, I think, with Drupal than it is with these other systems. Because if you're in a time of, we have to freeze budget for the next quarter, and then you find out that this major plugin that you're using for the community to authenticate is going away, well, you have no choice. You don't have to migrate everything up. Yeah, exactly. But with Drupal, maybe you disable new logins or something so that you have stable infrastructure costs or something like that. But all the current stuff works.
Very interesting to me, because like I keep going back to like Martin's last question about common features, and listening to Nick talk about like why Drupal is a good solution, and then inadvertently, I think Ron answered the next question that I was going to ask about Drupal building a DIY Drupal solution versus like an off the shelf solution, which we're gonna elaborate on, I think, a little bit. But going to the common feature set, like I'm thinking like, there are, these platforms do have common feature sets, but one of them is also the third party integrations, because I think
Right.
every system I've ever built has third party integrations. And if you've ever listened to the show, well, if this is your first time listening, welcome, and listen to the past episodes. But if you've ever listened to the show, like I often consider Drupal like the traffic cop or the glue in a lot of platforms, where it's kind of ingesting data from those solutions and kind of doing stuff with it. So I think like that's one of the common features you want to look at, right? Is like, oh, well, I have these third-party systems, and going to, Nick's point about forums, like maybe your forums are a third-party system that you need to integrate with. So being able to do that through Drupal is good. I think the other thing that we may have glazed over here too is to Ron's point about picking a solution that like there's a wide base of support for, right? One of the things is like Drupal does a lot of stuff out of the box. Like Drupal core checks a lot of boxes for a platform like this, but they're also very well supported modules like web forms, for example. Like every one of these platforms in some way, shape, or form needs a web form, right? And being able to pull web form off the shelf, put it in, and use it is very powerful, and kind of goes to that budget reduction piece of that we're talking about, right? It costs money, obviously, to have a team and maintain and keep this going, but like being able to pull a feature off the shelf like that and know like, oh, well, Jacob Rockowitz is supporting this and he's doing a great job, and like it's going to keep working, and is very reassuring. I also think, Ron, and this is kind of where I'd like to turn it to you here, is like being able to have, like, when you pick a software as a service or a platform as a service option, right? Instead of kind of building your own, whether it be with Drupal or something else, right? You like Drupal has a wide community where you can go out and say, hey, I need some work done on my platform. Here's what we want to do. As the architect, you can say, here's what we want to do. And you have a large group of people to kind of pick from to be able to do it, both companies and individuals, right? When you have that kind of SaaS or PaaS platform, like you're basically at the will of the company that is providing that to want to have to add that feature on their roadmap, right? So do you see value in that when you're picking one of these solutions?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it I think that the foundational piece of that is what both you in one way and Nick in another way have been talking about, and that's that standardization. And so because you have that standardization, from a certain perspective, you can take any PHP developer, you can take actually any developer, tell them what you need, and even if they didn't know Drupal at all, they got a better than average chance of being able to do something well. They may not be the best at it, but they could do it well. Versus if you go to something like, I'm not picking on Discourse, but it just keeps popping up because that's what we use. They do have plugins, they do have things that you can do, but you're at the whim of who can you find, who has that experience, what do they know, are they good? Like, I mean, I love Drupal. I'm using Drupal. I've used it for, well, you can calculate how long if you want to go back to 4.6. But my big thing is it's a powerful tool. You can hurt yourself as well. So the nice thing about kind of a more, say, point solution that's specific to communities could very well be that that it's got the basics, it's set up. A lot of other people are doing it and they're doing it well. So you can just kind of like join the group in that case. I think the big thing for me personally and for us as a company is we really wanted to be a little bit more ambitious than that, and not just check the box of, yeah, we have a community, we have a place where you can ask questions, we have a place where you can share things. Like that is important, but we wanted to push the envelope. So for example, earlier this year, I was working with the templates team to roll out a way for people to create their own templates on our platform. But we didn't at that time have, and we're still working on, a way to search for those. We have the templates we create that are official, but not the community ones. So I worked with them and I built a content type and an API endpoint that they could hit so that they could push it out and it would connect to the right user and it would adjust for what data wasn't there, all that other fun stuff. Relatively straightforward, relatively easy, I guess you could say, but provided a ton of value out of the gate. And we may or may not continue that. Like we might extend that or change that or do whatever later. But like we've talked about before, because it's so solid and I don't have to worry about that piece. Now, once it's built, it's set. Like it's good. I moved on to other things. I don't have to worry about like all of those other pieces. If I was in some other system, I would have to create something custom for that community library of templates, which would also be another thing. And as you know, with my solutions architecture background, you can't escape complexity. You're always going to have it, especially if you want to be ambitious, but the type of complexity you can contain. And personally, I found that the more individual pieces, especially individual pieces that come from who knows where, with some things are built well, some things are built poorly, you have so many more points of failure. So having as much as possible contained inside of my Drupal envelope that has the same foundation, that has the same entity model, that has the same APIs, that has the same, ways of extending and using, it really not only enables the customization, but also turns down the risk for breakage or failure, especially as we continue to scale, which is huge.
So the last 20 minutes of conversation here, can be summed up. The question is like, when do you suggest a DIY Drupal solution versus an off-the-shelf solution? And like, to sum it all up is like, it depends, right? It sounds like, as an SA, like a solution architect, I think we've all had to do a fair amount of analysis when building these types of solutions to say like, okay, well, is it a cost thing? Obviously, in most cases, an off-the-shelf solution is cheaper than a DIY solution. But then you kind of have flexibility and feature requirements there that could be at risk or suffer if you needed some really robust or customized functionality. So it's interesting to say like, hey, you really have to kind of do your analysis before you jump into one direction or another to figure out what not only the near term, but like, as you said, long-term goals are.
I think it's also interesting because I feel like when you're thinking about Drupal as potentially a solution there, it's also not binary, right? Like there's actually a spectrum, because you've got sort of like vanilla Drupal where you can build stuff out yourself. But then you've got, recipes, that are sort of in development as, again, that sort of idea of empowering the ambitious site builder to not even require development. Then you've got things like Open Social as a distribution that you can sort of like install and start using, and gives you a lot of things out of the box. And then even there's Open Social as sort of its own SaaS platform that's based on Drupal, so that if you wanted to sort of, maybe adopt a lot of the compelling features about Drupal, but not have to, basically have that team that's doing sort of the care and feeding of it on an ongoing basis, you can also go that route as well.
Sorry, you just gave me an idea, Martin, too. Or one of the advantages of Drupal with like Open Social is that, I don't know if they have this feature, but they have the ability to have this feature that a lot of other SaaS solutions don't, which is that if you start out in the situation where you're just using their SaaS offering, and then you get big enough that you kind of want to maintain it yourself, or you build a team internally that can do Drupal stuff, they can probably move you into your own environment, and it's Drupal. Although I'm sure their SaaS offering has some stuff around it that would need to be educated. But
so we actually looked at Open Social as well, and that is kind of one of those things. I believe they do have some stuff that they only have for the SaaS piece. It's kind of their secret sauce. But that is definitely one of the strengths of their offering is you can come in, you can do what you want, you have a lot of flexibility, but if you go too far off the map and you have to start like pioneering, you don't have to start over. You just have to take a slightly larger burden, say. But I think that's also one of the cool things And we chose not to go that route for a number of reasons, but I think that's also one of the cool things, like you were saying, Martin, about how you do have that spectrum, because you can also start with something very simple and you can run with that for a really long time. Like you don't need to get super complex. And then you can add a module here, add a module there, configure some stuff, hire a developer for a project, things like that. And you can evolve it over time. If you're willing to accept the care and feeding, and if you're willing to accept, the maybe the fear of that potential overhead. But I mean, I don't know. That's why I love open source, because just because something is, they say that it's got 3 or 4 nines and it's up and they take care of everything for you. I don't know what's going on inside that box, man. Like it could disappear tomorrow and then I'm out of luck. So at least I know what I'm working with here. And like, I think Nick, you mentioned it, like, especially after Drupal 8 now, like I know people have complained a lot about Composer and all of those things, but it really is a lot more straightforward and easier just to keep the lights on safely and consistently than I feel it used to be.
Go ahead.
I also feel like the way that, so many different entities now are fieldable, and sort of that site building experience is extremely flexible, but also consistent across all of those different things also makes it, I think, much easier for somebody coming in to sort of be able to, maybe they start by building a custom content type, but now they realize they can add fields to, users in the same way and some of those kinds of things, right?
Yeah, we've had that a couple of times. Like we had one, it's a silly example, but I think it's a good one. For our articles, there's a really awesome woman, Desi, who is doing a lot of our social distribution. And she was reaching out to the DevRel team. She's like, okay, so part of my problem is, I see there's this great content, but I'm not a developer. So I don't get it. Like, I don't understand. And I was like, oh, okay, that's easy. So I went in and I just added another field, and I put all the way at the bottom of the article. Doesn't display. You just have to edit it to go see it. And it's just called So What? And so the idea is that, when we're writing an article, we can put, why do people care about this? And I added it, and while we were on Zoom talking, and I just added, and I was like, well, go check this out. Click on the edit. You have edit rights. Go look at that. She's like, oh man, that's perfect. That's exactly what I need. I was like, yeah. And if you want, I can actually create like a list for you that shows you all of the newest ones, and you can sort it and filter it, and you can see the So What. And we were talking, and I started building that out. She's like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. You just did this? And I was like, yeah, this is easy. Like, but because it falls under the category of one of those things, it makes it simple to do.
So, Ron, we talked a little bit earlier in the conversation about some of the different types of sites. What do you think are some of the features that can be unique to those different kinds of sites, and how can Drupal help to support them to sort of, grow and evolve over time?
It's a really good question. The first thing is, and again, it all comes back to that flexibility, because different types of people have different needs. So we're working with developers, but a lot of what we're trying to put out, we have a low code tool for building UI interfaces on front of databases. Pretty straightforward. But a lot of the challenge is that our primary persona is going to typically be a backend developer, DB admin or a PHP dev or someone like that. And so even though the tool makes it easy, one of the powerful things is you can use JavaScript. So a lot of our stuff is actually educational and trying to show and help people who may not be JavaScript experts how to do things and how to create things and how to use our stuff in a way that's going to be really efficient. So a lot of it's educational for us. But the other piece that we're doing is we actually have a really great community in trying to build great engagement. So we need specific features like upvoting content, crowdsourcing content, notifications on comments, because we're trying to help tie these people together. It's not just a one-way stream. But if you turn that around, like I think Nick, you were talking about like if you have like readership and you're trying to drive engagement there, or Martin, you were talking about if you have like an intranet and you're trying to personalize what people can see. Those are capabilities that we have that we can do to a certain extent. We're not doing too much yet. But I think at the end of the day, it really does depend. Again, sorry, John, I'm going to come back to the "it depends" mantra, because it does, which is why I think it's so vitally important to make sure that people, especially people who don't have experience, not only building with Drupal, but if you don't have experience like building portals and communities, that you find someone who does to work with, whether it's an agency or a freelancer, because you need them to ask you those questions. Like, okay, well, you're talking about reaching out to people, but why? What are you trying to accomplish? What systems do you need to integrate with? Well, have you thought about this feature and how that could interact with your users? Have you thought about, what you're trying to accomplish from them? Are they more passive? Or are they active? Are there systems you need to integrate with? Are there features you're trying to automate? I think it really depends. But again, that's why one of the big reasons that we settled on Drupal was because instead of spending a bunch of budget, which we didn't have, and 6 or 8 months, which we didn't have, to kind of plan out this whole roadmap for like 3 years, it was like, I know the first step. I know that we need articles. I know we need tutorials. I know we need profiles. This is what we're starting with. And I would love to do community templates. I would love to do, a knowledge base. I would love to do forum. I would love to do job board. I would love to do all these great things. I don't know if we will. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't know how, but I know that I can, whatever path we choose, I know we can get there. So again, having that really made me a lot more comfortable about moving forward.
It's interesting as you're talking here. I'm realizing, we're talking about, features and types of community, but it's also very clear to me that these types of projects, need an architect or a product owner or somebody to, do what you just said. Know what the base set, MVP product is. Know where, the future is going to go, and then to be able to kind of connect those things. Well, no, we're not going to do feature X because first we need to do feature Z and Q, and then we'll come back and do feature X, in 6 months because it makes more sense. Which is, it is important. I think you touched on it there where you said like, hey, if you're an organization and you're going down this path, you're like, we need a portal, we need a community site, we need a thing, right? Get with an agency or an individual that has that experience and can kind of quarterback, to use a sports ball analogy, that sort of project, because, it's great to have all these ideas, but I think you have to put a plan together as to how to achieve them, or you're going to end up with an unstructured mess.
I totally agree.
I mean, just on that note, sort of anecdotally, I was working with an organization, this was the big complex project with multiple different users groups. And one of the features that they were really hot about was having an integration with Monday.com. As sort of the task management service that they used. And so I noticed that Monday.com actually had a couple of developers that are in the Drupal community. So I reached out to them and I said, like, hey, do you guys have any Drupal integrations? Because again, if there's a drop-in solution, that's always a better way to go. And the guy was like, well, why would you? Like, we ourselves don't do that. So like, sometimes again, having that architect that can help to ask those why questions and sort of like really try and get down to like, is there business value to the feature that we're talking about? I think is really essential in some of these conversations.
Ron, how important is UX for these types of sites? And I'm going to say this facetiously, but it sounds like most of your portals are developer portals, and developers don't need good UX, right?
So there's 2 kinds of UX, right? There's the consumption and then there's the creation. The consumption I'm not going to talk about because I'm not a designer. I'm just cheating by using Bootstrap, and I'm seeing things that look cool and I'm ripping off the best I can. And it's good enough, right? The really big thing that I try and focus a lot on when it comes to UX is on the admin and editorial experience. And yeah, I mean, I work at a company of hardcore developers, and I cannot tell you how many times I've had someone reach out and say, hey, I've got something I wanted to add to the portal. How do I do it? Like, well, you log in, you go to content, add article, and cool, go for it. Knock yourself out, have fun. And they come back, well, this doesn't make sense to me. I don't get it. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, title is title. Like, you know what tags are? Here's the body, right? So part of it is, I think, people don't read. And I think the thing I found very interesting was as much work and efforts I've gone through trying to like simplify. Like, I am crazy about hiding fields from the form display as much as possible because I want to reduce clutter. And I put descriptions for most of the fields. We're using Gin, so the UI is nice and clean and everything's good. Honestly, I think a lot of it comes down to fear. People are afraid they're going to break something, or they're going to mess something up, or they're going to do something wrong. And once I've had the chance, either because I've shown them videos or I've talked them through it, once they get it, they're off to the races. It's great. But the big thing for me is, how can we reduce that initial friction, number one, to get people to go? Because once they get to go, they're good. And I'm sure you've all had the experience, and I'm sure a lot of people listening have had the experience too, of you come either something you made or something you come across that people are using that has horrible UX, but it works well because people are used to how bad it is.
Yeah.
So having something that's good to start with makes it that much easier. And then the second thing I'm thinking about once you have somebody who's over that initial curve, like on the day-to-day, how do we make it faster? My required fields are always at the top. I always have defaults in there where they make sense. And I try and not have too many required fields, not put too many restrictions on, because I want to make it as fast and as easy for that flow to take place.
Yeah.
So smart defaults is a big part of it too.
I think we've all encountered people that are like, "Oh, Drupal's terrible," and it's because they've encountered bad admin UX, right? That's made their job harder. So Ron, I feel you. I agree with you. That making that admin UX better is always a priority. I'm sure for all of us. I think one other thing that's interesting, and this is something I always put into like training documentation or training videos or just in-person trainings that I do, is like showing people like it's okay to make a mistake, because like, here we go, we published this page, oh, it's wrong, okay, I edited it, okay, it's all better now, like it's
exactly
quick, it's easy, like go ahead, do it, you're not gonna break something, or if there's like revision or workflows and stuff like that, you have that kind of safety net for people. But yeah, I definitely agree that like make it as easy as possible. Now I'm wondering, something that you said is how you make or how you kind of improve it to make it easier for folks. Do you guys have some sort of kind of like feedback method that you can take suggestions from users? Like if a user's, I don't know, doing something or using a field in the same way, and there's a way that it could be made easier. Do you guys have like some sort of feedback form that they can fill out or something like that?
We do have an issue queue in a GitHub repo. No one uses it but me. But I tell people, the big thing is we have a Slack channel. It's called Project Portal. And so people going, hey, it would be cool if we could do this. Hey, I was doing this and this thing messed up. Hey, a user was trying to log in with GitHub and they hit a problem. And I'm like, cool, I can take care of that. So
got it.
Typically they use the Slack channel, and then I filter and sort that and either deal with it, put it on the backlog, or ignore it as I see fit.
There you go.
Before we move on from UX, I just wanted to call out that there's a core module that I've been falling in love with again recently, and that's shortcuts. For a long time, it was one of those modules that I just always uninstalled, but I found it so helpful just to add a list of links that, I mean, you can customize them per role, I think, or per user, but usually one list per admin, for the admin users is enough. But just having links to pages that they only need to occasionally use, like, or very commonly use, like those two edges, I think are the ones that it's most suited for. So one is like taxonomy pages, like That's actually one thing that's always been a little strange to me. If you give somebody permission to edit taxonomy, it doesn't show up in the admin menu for them.
Hmm.
It
Yeah.
just gives them access to that page. So I always put in shortcuts. Or like if there's a content type that they always create, then I put that
Mhm.
there too. So it's nice and convenient. But
So I'm gonna give Martin a shout out here for what you're saying and agreeing with you that I've rekindled my love of shortcuts because I've started to use the navigation module, and that has a good spot for shortcuts right in the new navigation sidebar there.
Hmm.
And there are a couple of pages in that navigation where I'm like, oh, I'm going to add a shortcut for this, like the status report page or the performance page, because those are nested a couple of levels deep. So
yeah,
I can definitely get behind shortcuts.
Well, thanks for that, John. And the other thing that I'll mention, just as sort of like something that you can do for admins, particularly because I think in a community site, often you have a lot more users creating content than you do in a normal Drupal site, where it's much more sort of like asymmetrical in terms of like small number of creators, large number of consumers. As you turn that around, there is also a module that I created called Add Content by Bundle, and basically the idea being that if you have, let's say, a listing of content, you can put a button at the top of that that says create one of these. And then that way they don't have to remember that there's like a menu that you go up to. It's like when you're looking at a thing, there's a call to action that says make one yourself, basically. And to me, that also can make for a really nice admin experience.
Very
Meet
interesting.
people where they are.
So
exactly.
We've talked about common features. We've talked about a lot of commonalities between the platforms, Ron. I'm wondering if you have seen any common content models with these types of sites. So, I think we talked about a few of them where like you might have like kind of like issues in an issue queue sort of thing, or comments
Right.
on an issue, that sort of thing. But I'm wondering if there are any other kind of content models that you see that are typical for these types of sites.
I mean, the good old standard article will take you a really long way, especially if you have a good, not too big, but you have a really good taxonomy for like the types of articles, the blog post, it's an announcement, it's a high level guide. One thing that I created on the Acquia dev portal that I loved so much that I recreated here was a tutorial content type where each step in the tutorial, it's just another, it's a steps is a single long text field that you can add as many as you want. So that then on the formatting side, when you're displaying it, you literally have step 1 is this, and it really is formatted nicely. Like, I think that makes it all the difference in the world. You also get consistency, because some people put like, prerequisites or things that you need, or they put an overview. Some people don't. Well, now I can enforce that consistency. So tutorial is a big one. I'm actually gonna shift it a little bit on you, man. The content types are so kind of all over the place. I think the big problem there is, how do you, either through experience or through having good advisors, how do you avoid the content type bloat? And how do you consolidate as much of that as you can? Like, I want as few content types as possible. But one thing that I experimented with a lot, well, not a lot, but on this particular portal, was actually really experimenting with media types. Yep. So, typical standard stuff like remote video, SVG. But one of the things that I think has worked out well, I don't know if anyone else agrees with me, is I actually have 3 different variations for an image media type. So one is for the avatar for the user, one is for a cover, which is at the top of an article or the top of a tutorial or the top of your profile page, and one is just the generic my images. The other thing I did was added just a Boolean field for whether the avatar or the cover should be listed in the public library. And so when we started, I actually pre-seeded and added a bunch of avatars that you could choose from in the public library and images. And even now, if I go and add a cover for something that I think would be useful again, I mark it as public. And then when you go to add an image for this field, you're only adding a cover image. And then you have the public library tab in Entity Browser, which shows all the public ones, which is the first one. Nick, to your point, comes back to UX, make it easy for people to reuse something because I don't want 50 million images. Second tab is my library of covers that I've added before, right? So I can use something I've done. And then the third one, which is the one I want to use as little as possible, is add a new one. But that shift of like treating even the same type of media as a different type so that you can like filter it and sort it out has actually been really effective. And I've seen people reusing those public things over and over again, which saves on space, which is kind of nice.
That's super interesting, because I think that's one of the things that in like air quotes new Drupal, right? I've used quite a bit is like media types and specifically not. I have used different media types, for example, for icons, like you're talking about
right.
with avatars, right? But also adding taxonomy to be able to classify images that are being uploaded. You know, I think that, and then updating the views for the media library to use those taxonomies to be able to filter. I think that aspect definitely is helpful for folks. And, you know, you're right. Like being able to section those things off as far as like, oh, well, this is a avatar. This is a, you know, a different type of image, you know, than the general image library is super helpful. And, you know, it promotes reuse, which is always good at keeping those.
And then
things
you can have different requirements and limits on like size and like, you know, your resolution and things like that. So for a cover, I want something that's pretty big. So I want to make sure it's at least big enough for when I'm going to factor it down, it's going to look good. But for an avatar, I can make it smaller and it will still look good.
So before we move on from this, because I think like we could probably have a whole show about content models for these types of platforms.
Agreed.
Before we move on, kind of like quick 1 minute answer. User profile as like a node, or user like expanding the user's actual account to be their profile? What's the preference?
I was wondering if you're going to come up with that, because I actually struggled with this. I the way that I think about it is you have two paths. If you're going to use the user account, it does simplify things because the author is the author, and it makes it easier for the user because it's a little less confusing. I think the problem and the thing you have to really be careful of there is that if you have any sensitive information, like, for example, we collect people's addresses and phone number so that we can send them swag for winning prizes or doing whatever. Well, I don't want to leak that. So I have to be like extra careful to only show the public stuff. On the other hand, if you have a content type for your user profile, that is a really beautiful firewall that makes it very clear. And especially if you have if I had a larger team, I would probably more go that way because then it's safer. The only downside there is that then you have to actually assign, you know, that content type, unless you do something weird with views, to be like the author. But that also has advantages because one person might write it, or upload it, and someone else might have it. So either way will work. We chose accounts to make it simpler overall because we had a smaller team. But if you got a lot of people and if you've got a lot of moving parts, then splitting them up is probably a good idea.
Yeah, I always think about if a user actually needs to log in to have a profile. But
yeah, I don't want to get
exactly.
I don't want to get stuck down in this rabbit hole, but I'll just say, no matter which way you choose, it's the wrong choice. It will come back to bite you.
There is no right choice. They're all wrong.
It's true.
And I'll also throw in as the module of the week voice that there are also modules that have sort of a middle ground where it has sort of like a discrete entity, and then you can have different profiles per role and a bunch of other cool things. So
here, enter the entity reference field. Oh God.
Yes.
We've just solutioned 5 ways to fix one problem.
Exactly. But I think that's a good example of, you know, some of the, it sounds like, you know, good experience that you've gotten, Ron, in terms of working on some of these different kinds of projects. If one of our listeners is looking to create one of these community sites, is there sort of like one top tip that you would give them to sort of set them up for success?
There's no substitute for experience. So either find or hire or beg or cajole someone who has experience that can give you advice. Community is great for that, and going out and talking to a lot of people. The other half of that, I would say, is just research, looking at what other products are out there. Do they make sense? What are their features? What are the limits? Like, you don't have to take 6 months to do this process. But I think if just evaluating what's out there, that's the first step in making the right choice. And then once you choose to go with Drupal, if you choose to go with Drupal, making sure you either have access to that resource that can give you that guidance, or you have access and you're taking the time to do research and talking with the community and put plans together and get feedback from people before you go too far. And it's one of the reasons I'm still in the community. The code's amazing, but I've always been able to get help. So you just got to ask. There's lots of people who want to help. And I'll go ahead and throw myself in that pile too. If anyone is building a portal, or they want to ask questions or has some ideas, you can find me on Drupal Slack too at RL Northcutt. So you can bug me. May take a couple days to get back to you, but I promise I will.
Awesome. Well, Ron, thank you again for joining us for the last few weeks.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/ddpromo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron. All right, as we close out the show, Ron, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Most of the places, RL Northcutt. So that's where you're going to find me. Also, coming up pretty soon, we will be trying out the private message module on the portal. So if you go to community.appsmith.com, you should be able to track me down there. So I would love it if people could help me test it.
Awesome. And how about you, Martin?
On most of the social and Drupal platforms, they can find me as @manclue.
And John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org @JohnPicozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixman, NICXVAN.
So if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Thanks, everyone.
Next week.
Thanks, everybody.